In the preparation of planting, or the preparation and the steps of planting in your garden, there are different types of food that are important to consider, things I would classify as staple items. And especially if you're just starting out to garden, if you have never tried to grow anything before, I would especially recommend that you start simple and small. Don't try to plow up an acre of ground and grow a large garden, but start small with something you can work with, something you can learn from, something that you can handle and get a good result because you can put in the necessary time and maybe allow for some trial and error and some research and discovery. If you start with items that will give you nutrition for your effort and will cover some of your basic staples, then you can get confidence that you can try other things, and you will get a feel for how much time is involved in each of the different things as well. In the resource section of this series, we will provide information that will show you how much of different staple items and other garden products that you can grow would be needed for a year's supply for each person in your family. Items such as corn, tomatoes, beans, potatoes, peas, different types of greens, things like cabbage, broccoli, lettuce, spinach, radishes, beets, onions. This even is quite a variety already of things that might be considered staple items. Things such as corn and beans are especially nutritious. And in the bean family, we have different types of beans even. We have different types that are sometimes classified as string beans that have strings to be pulled loose from the pods. There are stringless beans. There are beans that climb called pole beans. There are beans that grow more with a bush type habit called bush beans. There are soybeans, another family of beans. Soybeans are very highly nutritious. They're approximately 1/3 protein, approximately 1/3 carbohydrate, and approximately 1/3 fat. Soybeans are very nutritious, and they are not hard to grow. They do require being planted early enough in the season to be able to bloom at a certain time, and a certain length of time is necessary in order to grow a good production of soybeans. And yet at the same time, they have to be planted late enough to be past the time of frost, and the ground needs to be warmed up enough for them to be able to sprout. Different types of these plants will have different requirements, and we will furnish information also in the resource section describing some of the requirements for different types of plants. You can evaluate what you can start off with that will fit your situation and do what seems within your capability with the materials you have at hand that you could be most likely to succeed with. That success will give you confidence to keep trying other things. So picking some of these staple items and starting with them, and using especially seeds that are open pollinated seeds if possible. You may have to use whatever's available at first, but if you can find open pollinated seeds, and again in the resource collection we will provide the names of some of the seed companies where these are available. But whatever you can use, if you can get open pollinated seeds will enable you to gather some of the production of those plants and dry the seed and use it the next year and keep producing the same variety. Hybrid seeds do not allow you to be able to do that. You will produce something else if you produce anything. Some hybrid seeds will not produce useful food when you plant them after their first year's production. That is, if you keep the seed from what you produce the first year, you cannot produce the same variety like the parents were. It may be a bean or a corn if that's what you are growing, but it won't be the same variety with the same characteristics. So open pollinated, or sometimes they're referred to as heirloom varieties as well, are the best ones to use as you can. Then we also want to consider the different steps of the needs through the year as you plant and grow these things. You will want to put down on the soil the things initially needed, and we call that pre-plant. Pre-plant soil amendments or fertilization will include the things necessary before planting the seed. This would be like the lime to supply calcium, like the rock phosphate to supply phosphorus, and there may be some other things that are needed. Oftentimes the elements used in what we would classify as organic gardening approach are elements that require time to break down to be fully usable for the plants. These kind of things should be put on pre-plant because they're not going to benefit the plants near as much. They may to a small degree put on while the plants are growing, but the earlier they can be put on, the more they will be broken down and available for the plants to use. So these are things we want to put on pre-plant if there are different types of forms used in the organic gardening approach. These would include things like kelp meal, green sand, and other types of materials. The commercial fertilizers that are readily soluble must be used in much smaller amounts because they're more concentrated, and being readily soluble, if some of those are selectively used that are non-toxic and are not difficult for microbe activity and production to be able to operate with, then they can be used in smaller amounts through the growing season. Also, another area that provides us with nutrients to use in the garden is compost, and we're going to devote a little time to the understanding of compost and how to provide good compost in a little bit. But we want to especially recognize that compost is one of the things we can use for providing both short-term and long-term soluble elements for the plants to use. So we want to remember we need to give some thought to pre-plant nutrients, and then we also may have some nutrients that would be good to put down initially when planting, especially if we haven't put them down pre-plant. And then we need to consider the things that might be needed through the growing season, and this would especially be true if we notice any deficiency. Plants, like humans, cannot eat all of the food at one time, and that's enough to last them for the rest of the season. It isn't sufficient to eat a large meal at the beginning of the month, and then that's enough to last us through the month. Likewise, plants do not eat all of the nutrients they need at one time, and nutrients are constantly going through transactions and exchanges, combinations and combinations being broken up. There's constant changes taking place in the soil, and in these changes, the nutrients or energy being released will determine what's available for the plants. We can influence these exchanges, transactions, and energy releases by what we add to the soil even while the plants are growing. So supplying some maintenance feed during the growing season is also an important part of getting maximum nutrition from the plants. There are certain stages of development where some types of plants require much more of a certain nutrient. Corn, for example, as the ears are developing, after the ears start forming, they require more nitrogen. It is during the time that the ears are developing and forming when nitrogen deficiencies can start becoming apparent if there's not enough nitrogen available. Nitrogen in the soil corresponds to protein development in the plant. So if we have plants that are high protein plants, we need to make sure that nitrogen is available for those plants at the times that it's needed. Soybeans, as I mentioned a little earlier, are a plant that has a high protein content, being approximately 33% protein. But soybeans have the unique ability, along with other legumes, to be able to utilize certain types of microbes and bacteria that work in harmony with them to gather nitrogen from the air. The air, having approximately 75% nitrogen, is able to supply nitrogen if there's a way to put it into a form the plants can use. In legume plants, of which soybeans are in that family, there are microbes that can take that nitrogen out of the air, and then they attach to the roots of the plants and store that nitrogen in little nodules on the roots. If you pull up a clover plant or a bean plant growing in healthy soil, you will find many little nodules, or they even look like little knots on the root. And these are the nitrogen, the places where nitrogen is being stored by the activity of these microbes, taking nitrogen out of the air and storing it there. So soybeans are able to supply that nitrogen through the work of the microbes working compatibly with them. However, corn does not have that type of microbe available to attach to its roots like soybeans do. And so we must be sure to supply additional nitrogen in some form, whether through compost or through organic matter that will supply high levels of nitrogen, or through some type of soil amendment. And here is where some types of commercial fertilizers compatible with biological gardening can be used. So we want to remember pre-plant soil amendments, maintenance amendments while the plants are growing, and then also another area where we can increase the quality and nutrition of the food is through foliar feeding. The leaves of plants have a work that they do during the day, especially in the process of photosynthesis. They're taking carbon dioxide from the air, and they are forming different sugars and compounds in the plant that are stored in the tissue for the plant's needs. At the same time, the roots are pulling in minerals and things from the soil, and then these are circulating through the plants to meet the plant's needs and the needs of reproduction and the formation of fruit and vegetables, depending on what the plants are. There are in the leaves small openings referred to as pores in the leaves. These little openings allow the carbon dioxide and elements from the air to be passing in, and they also allow for moisture and even waste from the plant to be passing out. So there's a respiration that's taking place, going in and coming out. It's possible to take advantage of this process in the plant by putting onto the leaves at times when this ability to take in can be the greatest. It's possible to put onto the leaves different foliar feeds. We can use different types of materials such as blackstrap molasses, such as kelp liquid. Kelp is a seaweed. Many of the minerals that are being depleted and have been depleted from the soil and many other elements have washed into the ocean, and plants growing in the ocean are benefiting from these elements, and they are able to be harvested in certain situations, and then we can take those plants that are harvested from the sea, put them back on the land, and replenish many of those minerals. We can also use the extracts or liquid forms of some of these types of seaweeds or ocean products and put them in our foliar sprays to feed the plants through the leaves. If the soil nutrients are in a good proportion, the effects of foliar feeding can be very beneficial. Foliar feeding can help in many situations of deficiencies as well, but we can maximize both the effect of the nutrients in the soil as well as whatever we might put on with foliar feeds when we get things to their optimum levels. And that's the way we can pack the most nutrition into the food that we are getting. We oftentimes are unaware that the foods that are being grown in the store, or I should say the foods we buy in the store that are being grown commercially, often do not have the levels of nutrition that are really necessary for human good health. It is possible to buy food in the store that looks like food and can be eaten but has very little flavor and actually doesn't have enough nutrition to even provide the energy necessary to digest and metabolize that food. In that case, the body is having to use energy stored in its reserves in order to process the food, and a loss has taken place, a negative effect has taken place from eating that food. On the other hand, it's possible through proper practices and soil husbandry to grow food that's very packed with nutrition and gives us a high level of energy, of health, of nutrition. It gives us a sense of well-being. Oftentimes, we can eat food with this kind of nutrition and we can feel the difference in our body almost immediately, especially if our body has become more accustomed to food that has good nutrition. We will notice the flavor in the food. There's also another interesting feature that takes place in the growing of plants. Not all of the elements that are important for human nutrition are important for plant nutrition. An example is iodine. There is no indication from research done scientifically that plants react or suffer from iodine deficiency. Iodine is not one of the things that is evident in plants, either in the form of a deficiency or an excess, as a general rule. And so iodine can be totally lacking in the soil and the plants can still look very healthy and exhibit all of the indications of good health. However, if iodine is present in the soil, the plants will take it up and it will be in the plant tissue and in the food that the plant is producing. And when we eat the food, we then can get the benefit of that iodine that's present. If the plants are growing in iodine deficient soil, then of course the food will not be able to confer the levels of iodine in the diet for us. And so these deficiencies in the soil of some of these type of elements may not affect the plants and therefore may not be recognized as a deficiency, but yet in the consumption of them we can be experiencing deficiency in human health. Only as we have the ability to control the quality of our soil can we really ensure that all of these things that are essential for good health can really be getting into the plants and then be available in the food that we're growing. So using these areas of getting nutrition into the plant is important. The pre-plant preparation, the maintenance preparation while they're growing, and then foliar feeds. Even in some of the foliar sprays that I use, I add a little iodine, and that enables iodine to be present in the tissues of the plants and then in the food that I am getting from those plants.